Any video gamer worth their salt has touched tips with a Call of Duty game at least once. Us true gamers tend to look down upon the normies that play these games nowadays. One of the lowest tiers of gamer, only slightly above your aunt that spends hundreds of dollars a month on Candy Crush. This franchise continues to hemorrhage its last scraps of goodwill with each passing entry, becoming more disposable and vapid every single year. That's why it's so hard to believe there was a time when this series was lighting the world on fire. During the 6th and 7th generation, it was fairly common for a Call of Duty entry to pick up a few awards. The first game, Call of Duty, was a huge hit on PC, but the good people over at Activision weren't convinced that a decent port could be produced for the consoles of the time, so on PC it remained. They instead made a separate game for console players, Call of Duty Finest Hour, which was terrible. Go watch my last video to learn more. The original game's developer, Infinity Ward, were hard at work with Call of Duty 2, so development for Finest Hour was outsourced to the short-lived studio Spark Unlimited, thus beginning the trend of having multiple teams work on this franchise. Call of Duty 2 would eventually release 2 years after the original on PC and the brand new Xbox 360 console, but my parents can't afford an Xbox 360. At the time, even with the new generation, the biggest player base was still on 6th-gen consoles, and most companies still wanted to capitalize on that much larger market. So instead of a severely scaled-down port, they once again decided to develop a completely original game for these consoles. And that game would be Call of Duty 2 Big Red 1, the first game in the franchise made by the once-beloved developer Treyarch. Infinity Ward was a brand new studio at the time of the first game's release, a team of ex-Medal of Honor developers setting out to do the World War II video gaming thing their own way, but when Treyarch came on board, they already had a couple decent games under their belt. The most well-known definitely being Spider-Man 2, but they developed a bunch of other Spider-Man games of varying quality, and a few other notable titles, not becoming exclusive to the Call of Duty series until World at War. Adding the 2 to the title of this game was really more of a marketing tactic at the time, showing people that this game was new, just like the real Call of Duty 2. It made some sense at the time, but now it's just confusing. For example, I used to think this was Call of Duty 2 until very recently, but it is a separate game, just like Finest Hour. I used to think that game was Call of Duty 1. Boy, I'm stupid. See, I'm trying to cover these games in order, but this is gonna be the one minor exception. It was released alongside Call of Duty 2, but technically a week later, meaning if I was really doing these in order, I should cover this after Call of Duty 2, so why didn't I do that? Well, mostly because I had such a miserable time with Finest Hour that I just wanted to get this one over with. I know COD 2 is quite acclaimed, and I thought if I ended up enjoying that game a lot, it would be even more painful to have to go back to a clunky, slapped-together, last-gen, standard definition 4-3 consolation prize that only people with chronic nostalgia blindness could possibly defend. So I thought I'd suffer through one last piece of crap before moving on to the fun stuff. But wouldn't you know it, this game turned out to be awesome. I don't know if it was just because my standards were so low after the last game, or because I got the warm and fuzzies playing this on a CRT TV, but of the 3 Call of Duty games that exist, this is far and away my favorite. And yeah, I'm playing the Xbox version using an Xbox 360 on a CRT TV, so if the footage looks a little ropey, that's because it's pure analog, baby. If you have a problem with that, then you're in the wrong place, friend. The first major point of difference between this and the first 2 games is that you follow one set of characters. I was already starting to get sick of the stories of these games being much more focused on the war as a whole rather than on characters in a circumstance. They had you run through separate Soviet, American, and British campaigns, the story being much larger than any of the characters involved. But this time we're focused solely on the American 1st Infantry Division, or as they're known on the streets, the Big Red 1. Based on the real-life military division of the same name, handily nicknamed after the Big Red 1 displayed on their shoulder patch. In real life, they're the oldest service division in the Army, dating all the way back to World War I, and are still in service today, although the lineup has changed over the years. They even have their own theme song that barely rhymes. We play as Sergeant Roland Rogers, the guy on the cover. Other members of your squad include Brooklyn, whose whole thing is that he's actually from Queens.
Hey, you know, my dad runs a deli back in the Bronx, makes the best pastrami sandwiches you'll ever eat.
And we also have the, Kelly, I think. And then there's the guy with the glasses. Okay, so Brooklyn was the only character I remember by name, and I couldn't pick him out of a lineup, and I only remember him because of his thing about not being from Brooklyn, and because there's a character called Brooklyn in an old war movie that I love. When I say I like these characters, I don't mean the way I connect with characters in, say, Red Dead 2 or The Last of Us, or even later COD titles. But the squad itself has a personality, much more than your squad or any individual character in the last two. The chatter during gunfights is turned way up, they actually behave like a group of people in a situation, and even though I never found myself being able to latch on to any particular character, it was good to feel like one of the boys, rather than some Russian, and then a girl Russian, and then another Russian, and then a English, and then a American, and then another American. It felt like the story of this game was the story of this game, not the story of World War II. The cast shares a few of the less famous actors from the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. It was a big deal at the time. I didn't really recognize most of the Band of Brothers actors. I recognized a few known voice actors, as well as James Patrick Stewart, who I mostly remember from the god-awful Battlestar Galactica spin-off Galactica 1980, where he was simply credited as Patrick Stewart, but he spelled it slightly differently than Patrick Stewart. And speaking of Star Trek, we also have Mark Hamill doing the voiceover for the news segments in between missions, replacing the Allstate guy from Finest Hour. The Allstate guy was doing more of a documentary type of voice, and the lines were written in the past tense, whereas this game treats them more like actual news reports from the time, with Hamill doing a 1940s radio voice type of voice. A very sneaky performance. I feel like I can usually call it when I hear his voice, but I never would have guessed it was him. What, you want me to talk about the actual game? Well, sure. It's Call of Duty. You shoot and get shot at, but the improvements since Finest Hour are numerous. We're somehow still in health pack territory. I always think of this series as popularizing the regenerating health mechanic, but all three of these have you pick up health packs. Big Red 1 is thankfully far more generous with them. On normal difficulty, you'll have more than enough to get you through the weekend. This, combined with bountiful checkpoints, makes for a far more pleasant experience, because having to redo long sections of a game over and over is not only boring and frustrating, but it also makes the flaws more apparent and makes everything you're seeing and doing way less interesting. The core gameplay of any COD, the shooting mechanics, were the biggest improvement of all. I understand why Finest Hour couldn't make the shooting feel as smooth as it did on PC, but there was no excuse for making it as bad as it was, or for the absolute hell of not being able to shoot your gun while bringing the sights up to your eye. I went more into that in my last video, but I'm glad the studio behind that game lived a short, painful life. All this is to say that I was really worried these terrible mechanics were going to carry over into Big Red 1, but surprise, surprise, Treyarch were actually capable of creating a competent shooter. I tell you, shooting while aiming makes a world of difference. You can cook grenades, which makes them more strategic and less random, and the gunplay all around is just a lot smoother, as if they actually play-tested it to make sure it would feel good. Not the best it would ever get, but more than good enough for the time. There are also a few tank missions, which were a nightmare in the last game, but here they are once again actually fun. The overall mechanics of the tank are less janky, firing the machine gun is done with the X button and not by holding down the left stick, which was an awful idea, and whoever came up with that has never played a video game before in their life, and these tank parts are thankfully in third person, which really makes sense for a vehicle that's so unwieldy. And I like the Mario star painted on the side. I know I should probably be discussing the game more on its own merits rather than just talking about how favorably it compares to a terrible COD, but what I find most interesting about this franchise is seeing how each game iterated on the previous, and talking about them as if they exist in a vacuum is really hard. Visually, it is nice, which surprised me since it was kind of an afterthought of a game made for low-end consoles that lived in the shadow of its big brother, at least at the time. Finest Hour looked fine enough graphically, but it never looked good. This game, it looks pretty good, not only in terms of graphical fidelity, but also in terms of art direction and production design. Environments are more detailed, lighting is more deliberate, atmosphere is much more emphasized. The other ones could look real gray at times. The layouts of the levels feel far more natural and dynamic. We explore the Africa setting a lot more. You fight through the streets of Sicily, parts of France, you fly over the Mediterranean, and we end the game fighting through Germany, not quite wrapping up the war by the end of the story. Oh my god. Oh no, Brooklyn! He's the guy whose name I knew! We're still using health packs as I mentioned. Crouch and stand are still a different button, which I still don't like. We still use the guided compass. There's still no sprint. There's still no shotgun. Still no pistols. I'm unreasonably intrigued to learn when these things change. No spoilers in the comments. Let's see, I do have a couple of notes here, some light critiques. Technically, the game is quite well made. I didn't notice a single bug, but this one part in particular had some serious frame rate issues. The beach landing landing scene is a million years long. Like, it's cool at first, but why? Having to manually pick up ammo is still stupid. Why would I ever not want the ammo? There's still no split screen, which is lame. Otherwise, you've done a great job. The menu is nice, very classic and bold, while still having some grit to it. We can see what the different controller configurations actually mean. The other two did let you change the configuration, but they never showed you what they actually were. This one shows you. A wise quality of life improvement. Good job on this rainy trench mission. The level design is super fun. The atmosphere stands out significantly. It feels kind of spooky, real cool. But the highlight of the game, the thing it seems most everyone remembers best, is the bomber mission. This is the one mission in the game where you play as a different character who's part of a crew of a B-24 Liberator. I don't know much about military tech, and I usually don't care about it, but I've always thought World War II bombers are some of the coolest planes ever made. And this mission does not squander its potential. It begins calm, you're sitting in the cockpit turret, you can see the other bombers flying information with you, but soon the enemy arrives, and throughout the mission you're instructed to move to different parts of the plane and shoot down enemies from other turrets and bomb some boats and such. What's really cool is how you have to physically move through the plane. You get to see all the little details of everything, and what's most coolest of all is seeing all the destruction of the plane throughout the mission. By the end, you're essentially balancing on a 2x4 over open air. Good graphics on the ocean down there, by the way. But when it's over, you feel like you really made it out by the skin of your teeth. Like the best COD campaigns, it's just a short, concentrated dose of good stuff after good stuff, and you are now educated about this forgotten gem of a Call of Duty game. If you're a fan of World at War and Black Ops, it's really cool to see Treyarch's first stab at this franchise, and it's a good bit of casual World War II media that you can easily blast through in a weekend. So pay your respects to Brooklyn by giving this video a like, and subscribe if you think more content like this could be good for you. And check out my longer videos when you have time. This is Jimmy Fallon signing off.